My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. It's always exciting to start something new in true Arendtian fashion, the new beginning. And today we start a new book, The Human Condition. It's a book that Hannah Arendt published in 1958. It comes out of a ton of work she did in the 1950s. And in this regard, it's actually really wonderful that for those of us who've been here the last 6 or 7 months, we've read two books, Thinking Without a Banister, the collection of essays edited by Jerome Cohn, and then The Promise of Politics, another collection of essays edited by Jerome Cohn. Thanks to Jerry for his amazing work, both of which deal with the essays and the writing in the 1950s that very much go into and make up what Arendt is going to write about in this book, The Human Condition. If you study political theory, like I came out of, this is probably her most known and read book, although obviously outside of political theory, books like The Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem are probably more widely read. But this book is in many ways Arendt's theoretical magnum opus, if you want to call it that. And I don't like using the word theoretical in conjunction with Arendt because I don't think of her as a theorist. I think of her as a thinker. But this is a work in which she's really engaging with the biggest questions she engages with in her work. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human in the modern age? As we get into this book, you'll see that I'm going to read it a little differently, I think, than a lot of people in political theory or political science do. There's a tendency amongst Arendt's scholarship to read this book, according to what I would consider the 3 middle chapters on labor, work, and action. And those chapters are deeply important. They're 3 of what she calls the basic faculties, laboring, working, and acting, which make up what it means and has meant to be human. But Arendt is concerned with much more than that historical analysis of the human faculties in this book. The bookends of the book, the prologue at the beginning and the final chapter on the Vita Activa at the end, are really frame the book quite differently. In that regard, the book is about the fate of humanity in the aftermath of the scientific age. That's a big question. What is the fate of humanity in the aftermath of the scientific age? Arendt is going to argue at the end of this prologue that we read today, that on pages 5 into page 6, that the age of science, the modern age, began in the 17th century and came to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. That's the modern age. Then she talks about something else, the modern world, right? And the modern world is the world of the atom bomb and of Sputnik and of automation. And we now live in this modern world, and it is above all defined by what she's going to call world and earth alienation. And both world and earth alienation have their origins in the scientific foundations of the modern age. And so the question that this book asks, right, the overarching question, the big question that this book asks is, how does the rise of science in the modern age lead an alienated humanity to turn away from the earth and also the humanly conditioned world? How does science and the rise of science lead us to alienate ourselves from the earth and the world that we humans have created? And one of the things that we need to get clear on it's not often enough distinguished in Arendt's work, is the distinction between earth and world. And so this is part of what we'll talk about. But I want to step back a second because I said we're reading this book, The Human Condition, published in English by the University of Chicago Press in 1958. Okay, and it's been published in many, many beautiful editions, all the same. We love them all. But Arendt, as many of you know, was German and spoke German beautifully. And for all of her major books, she translated her own books into German. Didn't trust another translator to do it. And she didn't just translate them, she rewrote them. They're often quite different. You know, I shouldn't overstate that. The general idea is the same, and 90% of the words are the same, maybe 98%. I haven't done a full calculus. But she does change things. She adds words, she changes formulations. And one thing Arendt does is add a lot of poetry into her books when she writes in German. She often she said in numerous accounts that she knew the whole tradition of German poetry by heart. And you know, she knew a lot of it. And so the German poetry, both sometimes literally, but sometimes figuratively. My colleague Thomas Wild has done some of the best work on this. But you know, there's resonances in her words that if you know German poetry and you read the German, will often come alive. And once you read the German and the German poetry, when you read the English, you can see that when she was writing in English, she was actually often translating German poetry. It's an extraordinary aspect of her writing that has been ignored for a long time. And so I want to point out that in this book, right, the Vita Activa, which is the 1967 book that was published by her, rewritten and translated by her. Again, 98% of the book's the same, right? And it's not like we need to go back and change everything. But just in the prologue, the first page of the book is all new. None of what's in the entire first page of the German edition was not in the English edition. And that first page consists of two things, right? And I think they're incredibly important in my reading of The Human Condition. And so I want to just mention these two things, and we'll spend a little time on them, setting up what The Human Condition is about. The first is an epigraph. And it's an epigraph from Bertolt Brecht's first play about Baal. It's not a widely done play. I'll be honest, partly because it's incredibly, well, I mean, one way to read it is incredibly misogynist. I mean, I don't think you could produce it. I don't know if anyone's produced it recently. I'm not sure you could get away with producing it today. But at the beginning of the play, as a prologue to the play, there is a choral ode, which goes by the name of the Hymn of the Great Baal. Baal was a fertility god, and this fertility god has a lot of sex in the play. And there's an enormous amount of images of light and dark, and there's a sexual desire that Baal has for a tree in the play, in addition to many heterosexual conquests. He's also a god of resurrection, and thus sort of like Dionysus, and is a god of regeneration and spring. You can start to hear some Arendtian themes in this: natality, newness, rebirth. Remember, this is her first major book after she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism. And so I wanna begin. I've put in the chat. If you see, if you go back to the chat, if you guys have your chats open, I gave you two things. In German, the two stanzas that Arendt cites as an epigraph, and then a link to the lyrics in English and a recording that David Bowie did of this. And I don't usually do this, but I thought I'd play. It's 4 minutes. I thought I'd play the David Bowie rendition for you. I hope you don't mind. Here you go.
Whilst his mother's womb contained the growing bough, even then the sky was waiting quiet and pale, naked, young, immensely marvelous, like Baal loved it when he came to us. That same sky remained with him in joy and care, even when Baal slept peaceful and unaware. At night a lilac sky, a drunken bough, turning pious as the sky grows pale. So through hospital, cathedral, whiskey bar, Baal kept moving onwards and just let things go. When Baal's tired boys, Baal cannot go far, he will have his sky down there below. When the sinners congregate in shame together, Baal lay naked, reveling in their distress. Only sky, a sky that will go on forever, formed a blanket for his nakedness. And that dusty girl, the world who'll laugh and yield to the man who'll stand the pressure of her thighs, sometimes gave him love bites such as can't be healed. Baal survived it, he just used his eyes. And when Baal saw lots of corpses scattered round, he felt twice the thrill despite the lack of room. Space enough, said Baal, then a thick on the ground. Space enough within this woman's womb. Any vice for Baal has got its useful side. It's the men who practice it can't abide. Vices have their point once you see it as such. Stick to two, for one will be too much. Slackness, softness are the sort of things to shun. Nothing could be harder than the quest for fun. Lots of strength is needed and experience too. Swollen bellies can embarrass you. Under gloomy stars in this poor veil of tears, Baal will graze a pasture till it disappears. Once it's been digested to the forest deep, Baal trots singing for a well-earned sleep. Baal can spot the vultures in the stormy sky as they wait up there to see if Baal will die. Sometimes Baal pretends he's dead, the vultures swoop. Baal in silence dines on vulture soup. When the dark moon drags him down to its prize, what's the world still mean to Baal is overfed. So much sky is lurking still behind his eyes. He'll just have enough sky when he's dead. Once the earth's dark womb engulfed the rotting Baal, even then the sky was up there quiet and pale, naked, young, immensely marvelous, like Baal loved it when he lived with us.
So, I'm sorry. There you go. I hope you all could hear that. It's great Bowie rendition. So these two stanzas that are at the beginning of this book of Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, or in German, the Vita Activa, they go that while his mother's white womb contained the growing ball, even then the sky was waiting quiet and pale, naked, young, and immensely marvelous, like Ball loved it when he came to us. And then the last stanza, once the earth's dark womb engulfed the rotting ball, even then the sky was up there quiet and pale, naked, young, immensely marvelous, like Ball loved it when he lived with us. There's a lot in this in these stanzas and in this poem. There the whole play and the stanzas are a celebration of a kind of chaotic, irrational, and self-destructive world, a celebration of the sexual and animalistic human urges, of an intense human energy, an animal energy of Baal, who's the hero here, and who sees the world in all of its desire and all of its evil. And there's a lot of really dark imagery here, and decides to love it anyway and call it beautiful. So why does Arendt begin this book, at least in the German 1967 version, with this epigraph? Well, I think there's a number of reasons, but one is that if you take a look back at the epilogue that she wrote to the origins of totalitarianism in 1951, in the first version, which sadly is not included in most published versions of the origins of totalitarianism that you can buy today. In that original epilogue, Arendt, has just talked for 500 pages about the horrors of totalitarianism. And she says in this epilogue that man has come to resent everything given to him, even his own existence, right? So think about Baal. We resent even our own existence. We resent the earth. To resent the very fact that man is not the creator of the universe and himself, that we're not all powerful. We've come to, as we believe that we've become gods, as we believe we are in charge, we resent anything that shows our weakness. And she says this fundamental resentment, in this fundamental resentment, we refuse to see that the world is beautiful. We refuse to see that there is rhyme and reason in the given world. And in his resentment for a world that we no longer see as beautiful, she says, man proclaims openly that everything is permitted. Not only that everything is permitted, and then even that everything is possible. And since he knows that he is a law-creating being, and that his task, according to all standards of past history, is superhuman, he resents anything that limits him. Now, the alternative to this resentment, she says in the conclusion to the origins, would be a fundamental gratitude for the few elementary things that indeed are invariably given to us, such as life itself, the existence of man, and the world, right? An elementary gratitude for life, existence, and the world. That's the kind of feeling that Baal explores and stands for, this Dionysic gratitude and joy at the world. In one of the passages that you heard Bowie sing about, but is not there, Brecht sings about how all sins have a good side to them. We may not like the sinner, but the sin itself has a good side, and we should never throw it out. And this is part of Arendt's love of the world, her amor mundi, this idea that even sins, even something like totalitarianism, can be reconciled, and we can love the world in which these things happen in. And she finishes her conclusion to the origins by saying that in the sphere of politics, this gratitude for the world, this love of the world, emphasizes that we are not alone in the world, that we can reconcile ourselves to the variety of mankind, to the differences between human beings, which are frightening precisely because of the essential quality of rights of all men and our consequent responsibility for all deeds and misdeeds committed by people different from ourselves. Only through insight into the tremendous bliss that man was created with the power of procreation, that not a single man but men inhabit the earth. So why have I spent so much of your time on this little epigraph that's not even in the English version, but is added to the German version? Because in this epigraph from Baal by Brecht, we see Arendt, I think, giving us a clue how to read this book. This book is about the fact that even sins have a useful and good side to them. This book is about how not to resent the world and ourselves, how not to resent the world that is given to us, even if it's a world filled with horrors. This book is about how to be grateful, have gratitude for life, existence, and the world. And it's ultimately about how to be grateful for plurality, for the fact that we humans are different and that we don't share the same opinions or ways of living or values, and that plurality, while it's sometimes harrowing and dangerous, is what makes human life, specifically human life, glorious. That is an incredible insight for someone who survived concentration camp, who survived 17 years as a stateless person, who had to leave her country and remake her world. That's an incredible insight for her to begin this book with. Because as I said a little earlier, this book is about the fate of humanity in the aftermath of the scientific age. And as being about that, it is about what she's going to call our alienation from the earth and the world, and thus the potential radical transformation of what she's going to call the human condition, what it means to be human. What she's actually going to argue in this book is that what human life has been for thousands of years is on the precipice of undergoing a fundamental transformation. And it may be that the human life that we have going forward will be unlike the human life that came before it. Not that it's inhuman, but it's differently human. And that different humanness, that different aspect of what it means to be human, what she's going to say in this book, I'm not going to tell you whether it's good or bad, right? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you we have to think about it. We have to think what we are doing, right? That's the, that's the way she approaches these things. I think she probably has a lot of worries about what's happening. I mean, she wouldn't be writing about it the way she is if she didn't. And we're going to get into that as we read this book. But there's a joy that she puts at the beginning of it. And a joy and a marker of the human drive for recreation, right? Regeneration, natality, newness, that has a sexual energy to it in a fertility god in Baal. And, you know, we can certainly open her up to a feminist critique. But that's the opening. That's the opening play here in these pages. There's then another new first paragraph in the German. I'm not going to spend as much time on that. It's basically about satellites, and so, but it's not, but it adds to what she wrote in the English, right? The English begins with the launch of Sputnik, the Sputnik spacecraft in 1957. The new first paragraph that she writes in the German edition, what she adds to it is that with the launch of satellites into the world all, the Weltall, she calls it, these satellites that we've now launched that wander around in space in gravitationally determined path, she says, they lead to the fact, they make it so that what only 10 years ago was an infinitely sublime way off, the universe, the outside, the space was something that was way out there, right? And it was once an unapproachable mystery, now has let itself fall, gefallen lassen, right? Has let itself fall, and shares with other earthly objects that we make on Earth, the same qualities. We've now made the world all, the universe, the unfathomable, unapproachable mystery. We've brought that to be an object of the world, a store of the world, a reserve that we have out there. And we made the space and the unapproachable and the ineffable now increasingly human. And then she goes into the English with a bit of a change, but largely the translation. I know I sent out a video with an introduction that I did a few years ago. I don't even remember how many years ago to this text. I know I look a lot younger. And so I don't want to repeat all of it, and I've already spoken for a little while. Let me just say that the actual prologue in English is broken into two parts, or two threatening events. She says there's two great threatening events that are threatening the human condition. One is the launch of Sputnik, and the other is the rise of automation. Somewhat briefly, because I already spoke about this in the introduction that we sent out, and you guys can all watch it, and we'll talk about it. What Sputnik represents, and what the sending of satellites into space represents for Arendt, is a desire to escape the Earth, right? A desire to that, a belief that man will not remain bound to the Earth forever, as she writes. And this desire to escape the Earth, to break the bounds of our earthliness, is to free ourselves from all those earthly limitations, our bodies, even our human minds, and move into a kind of universal intelligence and universal life that would be free from gravity, but also free from the perils of earthly living, that we'll die, that we're mortal. And it's this desire to escape the Earth that for Arendt is represented by Sputnik, and is so deeply important. And she talks about it as an emancipation and secularization, a turn away from God. We've already had a turn away from God, she says, but now we're doing something different. We're turning away from the Earth. And And this is that earth and world alienation that she's going to tie to science in this book, and we'll have a lot to say about it. But in the English, she says that the earth is the very quintessence of the human condition. Interestingly enough, a line that doesn't appear in the German version. What she means by that is that only on earth can man live without artifice. We don't need, like, if we're up in space, we need oxygen pumped in, or we need an atmosphere or things like that. Only on earth can we live without artifice. And only on earth are we like animals. Are we alive? Is living part of who we are, and thus fated and living according to chance and things we can't control. And it's this chanciness, this fatefulness, that is part of our earthliness. And with the rise of technology and our desire to control our lives and increasingly program our lives, this animalistic aspect of human life. Now, again, think back to the Song of Baal. This animalistic drive is increasingly lost, and we are increasingly losing our connection to life, to the earth, to the animalistic part of human nature, and becoming simply a human creation. And so that's why she talks about artificial insemination and test tubes and cloning, right? We are going to, the goal, as she talks about in a number of her essays, the goal seems to be to create an artificial world, a new planet where we could live in a perfect environment with perfect people, with perfect things. And that she says this is actually a deep human desire. And it's been a human desire since way back. I mean, Sophocles sung about it in the choral Ode to Man in the Antigone. But she says, for the first time now, we're in the position potentially to reach that attempt, to actualize that attempt to actually remake ourselves and our world, absent the fatefulness and arbitrariness and naturalness and animalness of life. And then she ends this first section saying it is now a political question, right? Whether we should rebel against the human condition of our earthliness or not. She says there's no reason to doubt that we can do so. The question is, ought we to do so? And that's the political question she leaves us with, and says that this is a question for all of us, not just for scientists or for professional politicians. The second threatening event is automation. Automation threatens to release us from labor, right? And this is labor, as we will see when we read the sections on labor, is the first, is a deeply human activity. It's the activity by which we act upon the earth, labor upon the earth and other things in order to keep ourselves alive. We produce food and shelter, and all of those things that we need to live on earth. We are in a rebellion against labor and technology, namely automation and now artificial intelligence. I mean, she wrote this book 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, almost 60 years ago, we're now in the position to free ourselves from labor. The difficulty with that is that not only is that as we free ourselves from labor, what's left, right? She says that in all societies, the few have been able to free themselves from labor. The aristocrats, the thinkers, maybe those who own slaves, and we should talk about the slave question. But what she's saying now is we've reversed it. The pyramid is reversed. It's now actually the few who labor very hard and work, those of us who are in this world work 24 hours a day with the internet and computers and whatever. It's the few of us who work very hard and support the vast majority of us whose jobs, honestly, don't pay for them to live. Uh, um, the vast majority of labor is probably economically superfluous, if not now, fairly soon. This is what she's writing about. And in another essay that she actually gave in the same year that she published the German edition in 1967, actually in 1966, so 1 year before it, she gave a speech to the first annual conference on the cyber cultural revolution in New York City. Not many people would have known she would have spoke there, but she did. And in that speech, she says that we're evolving from a laboring society into a society without labor. And she says that the great challenge of this is that we are losing the cycle of life, right? Think about Baal, light, dark. He's born, he dies. We're losing that cycle of life. And she calls that cycle of life living, laboring, exhaustion, and recovery. And she says this cycle has its own rewards. There's a kind of bliss in working a whole day, coming home, relaxing in front of the TV and having a drink, and then going to bed and then getting up and doing it again with a day or two of rest in between, right? And she says that cycle of life is deeply human. And that's part of what we're going to talk about when we read the section on labor. And that we have increasingly alienated ourselves from that, first with the Industrial Revolution, but even then we still had a cycle of life, now much more so. And Marx, right? Marx thought this is great. We'll free everyone from labor and they'll be able to read poetry and go fishing and have hobbies and all sorts of other things. And Arendt says, no, in all likelihood, and we've seen it happen, when we free people from labor, they don't take up music and hobbies. They watch movies and take drugs and sit in front of the TV or Netflix. And they buy things, they consume. And so what she says is what's replacing the dignity of the cycle of life is consumption on the one hand. We're entering a consumption society where we labor not, to eat, but to consume more and more junk. And secondly, what she calls vacant time. This is not actually in the Human Condition. It's in this other essay called On the Human Condition, which she writes in 1966. And the problem of vacant time, she says, is that he who does not spend energy shall not be able to sleep. Increasingly, many of us are bored, don't have enough to do. And so we occupy our time either with work we don't need in order to live, or more generally with consumption and with entertainment. It's the old stay up 3 in the morning watching Netflix idea. We're not tired enough to sleep. And so we entertain ourselves. And it's this loss of labor and loss of the dignity of the cycle of life through automation, and the alienation from the earth and our world that Arendt argues is the second great threat to the human condition. She ends the prologue with a meditation on thinking, where she says this book is a matter of thought, and thoughtlessness is the outstanding characteristic of our time. And what she proposes, she says, is simply to think what we are doing. I've talked for longer than I usually do. I'm sorry. There was a lot to bring about. It's amazing that in an 8-page preface, there's so much in it. I'll stop. Let me say at the beginning, we have a lot of new members today, it seems, which is great. Welcome. Thrilled to have you. The primary way to ask questions is by raising your hand. You can do that by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen. And next to your name, you should be able to click on the raise hand function. since we have a lot of people, and I'm thrilled we have a lot of people, I'm going to ask you to keep your questions short. You can make comments, but let's try and keep the questions and comments short. I will interrupt after a minute or so if it looks like it's going on. We have a lot of people and I want to get as many people in as possible. There is a chat function and you guys can ask questions there and other people can answer. I won't have time to read the chat during this as much as I'd like, but there we go. And I'll just go in order. If you have something to respond to a particular point, let me know. Say I have a response, and I'll let you in. All right. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion. James Kyberd, you start.
Roger, I felt like I was going to church. I love what you said. I am a ball boy, and I've worked on that character. And given the last few weeks, we have to pay attention to our body mind, not just the mind, the body mind. What is going on in the body? What's happening in America right now is we're doing this. As represented by this letter, an obscene tongue, closed circle. Why I'm here at HA, Hannah Arendt, notice the space, the movement. The gesture for Hannah Arendt is ha, ho, ha. I'm talking about survival here. This is an ad for thinking over evil.
James.
Stay with us, thinking over evil. This is basic training for me. I have never done so much thinking in my life. Thank you, Roger. I love the blue of your shirt. God bless you. And this prayer and celebration of this new book is for all of you. Have fun.
Thanks, James. I really appreciate it. I love the props. The only thing I say is you need a picture of Hannah Arendt behind you on your desk.
It's coming. It's coming.
It's coming. I see that happening.
I don't want the picture to be read in the wrong way.
I love your primal energy, which very much reflects the Brecht and Ball.
Yes.
I won't say anything other than that, but thank you. Thank you very much.
Is there an English translation of the German that you
Yeah, I posted it. It's the first thing in the chat. I posted the translation that's used in the David Bowie song. So it's the first thing in the chat. And you can get it there.
Roger, the chat only starts for us once we log in. So
I apologize for that.
But I actually posted the link.
Oh, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack.
I'll repost it now just so that it's fresh. And everyone has it. It should come up right. Oh no, I have it wrong. I'm sorry. Someone else can post it. I apologize. All right. Who's next? Hal.
I really enjoyed reading this introduction. I think a lot of people mentioned in the chat how this is such a modern, it seems like this could have been written yesterday with the fears over automation, as well as just this general, one movement we're seeing right now is kind of this idea of like transhumanism, where people are saying that we should kind of move our brains into the digital space. I believe somebody mentioned Neuralink, this idea that we could have these enhanced computerized brains, and also Zoom and similar technology. Of course, we're all using Zoom right now, but the way that seemingly everything is done online right now, and how that breaks up I was thinking also how that breaks up people's day-to-day routines. You wouldn't have that natural routine because you'd be jumping in and out of things like this in the middle of or between aspects of work. So do you think that Arendt was particularly prescient in predicting this, or was it more of that? In other words, is what she's saying now more true than it was then, even if some of the references to things like Sputnik might seem a bit rusty?
That's a great question, Hal. I'm not here to say that Hannah Arendt is a prophet. Although I think that she was clearly looking at very deep trends about the way technology and science together were changing what it means to be human. I just posted in the chat a link to an essay I published a few years ago called Singularity in the Human Condition, which is about reading Arendt alongside Ray Kurzweil and some of these transhumanists that you mentioned. Yes, I mean, I think Arendt, what Arendt understood deeply is that the drive, the hatred of our human fallibility, of our human limits, was ancient, right? It goes all the way back to the Greeks, and she says that, you know, I mean, if you go back and read the Ode to Man from Sophocles in Antigone, you know, it's about how man is going to walk on water, you know, with ships, and we're going to like fly through machines, and we're going to take over. There's this desire for man to do what they can't do, for human beings. But she says there were always limits. There were things we couldn't control: the past, the future, our birth, how we came into the world. And increasingly, we can. You know, her model for this, which you'll get in the very final 2 or 3 pages of the book. So I hope I'm not giving you a spoiler. If you want a spoiler alert, close your ears for 20 seconds. Her model for this is that we will all come to start at some point live on a spaceship in which the entire, it's like the Starship Enterprise, the entire atmosphere is created by man and by humans, and nothing is by chance. Everything is chosen. There's no fate left. And you know, that's for her the culmination of the loss of Earth, the earthliness, the fatedness, the chanciness of what it means to be human, and the full human production of it. Now she says that's not inhuman, right? It's still human. We're still humans. We'll just be humans differently. But what she is going to say is that that's a fundamental change of the human condition, the way that humans have lived on Earth for over 2,000 years. And that's sort of the argument of the book, is that we are now have the capacity, and in all likelihood are changing what it means to be human, not in our nature, but in the condition. And that's what needs to be thought. You know, so again, you know, she says in this preface written in 1958, right, that, you know, in 100 years, we'll be able to have test tube babies and, you know, and extend man's life beyond the 100-year limit, and all this stuff. And, you know, we're 60 years from that, and we're almost there. So, you know, if you want to call her a prophet, you know, go ahead. I don't think of it as prophecy. I think of it as she sees where we're headed and she's talking about it. Tara, you're next.
Hi, thanks. Great introduction. My question came up in the chat a bit. It's about her statement that what cannot be spoken about, what does she say, is no longer, that we're in danger, that speech has lost its power, and whatever men do or know or experience can make sense only to the extent that it can be spoken about. And I guess this is more of a comment. I was just thinking about, you know, finance and derivatives and the kind of complicated world of finance that more and more people are kind of, even as hobbyists, involved in, but don't really know how it works. And of course, the GameStop hubbub is an example of that. And then I'm also thinking about our interaction with computers, but that so few people actually know how to code or even how their computer works. And so our lives have been so entangled with this technology, but that knowledge is really not common. It is very specialized. And I wondered if that is related partially to her concern about what can be spoken about.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, as I said, the overarching theme of this book is Earth and world alienation, right? Earth alienation is this alienation from ourselves as sort of this living primal being. A fate, and also one that is thrown into the world fatefully and without our control. But world alienation, which is sort of in many ways, well, I mean, it'd be interesting to think at the end of this, I still don't know which is more important for her, Earth or world alienation. I think they're both related and go together. But world alienation is our alienation from the humanly created world, the humanly artificed world, the world that we make together. And it's that, and so when we begin speaking in symbols, numerical symbols, mathematical symbols, scientific symbols, derivatives, all these things that you're alluding to, but even, when Copernicus said, actually, it's not the sun moving, it's the earth moving. From her point of view, that alienates us from our world. Because in our world, we see the sun moving and we begin to distrust the world. And that Copernican revolution, it's no accident, it leads to the Kantian and Cartesian revolution, where we increasingly distrust the world out there. Please mute yourselves if you can. Distrust the world out there and increasingly live in an ideal world in our heads. And this is going to be what she's going to talk about in the last chapters of the book, and how both the Copernican and the Cartesian and Kantian revolutions created interior life that separates us from the world, that leads to a flight from reality. It's no accident when James holds up Q, right? It's no accident that it is so easy and to believe in conspiracies and fictions today, because our entire world is one in which we don't understand the world. The world doesn't make sense. I mean, you talk to an economist and you ask them to explain what's going on in the economy, they can't explain it. How am I supposed to do it, let alone how is someone who never went to college? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And so in a world in which we are increasingly alienated and don't understand and speechless in front of the world, it's not, it's totally understandable, Arendt says, that people will start making up simple stories that make sense to them, that give them some control over the world. And so the political import, right, of this world alienation is real, right? It's not, it's not some accident. And we have to, she says, and this is, what she says in that section at the end of the Origins that I read earlier, that in the sphere of politics, what gratitude reminds us is that we're not alone in the world, and that the world is plural, and that the world doesn't always make sense. And we are grateful for its complexity and for its not making sense. But that's one of the hardest things to teach people, because when people feel threatened and lost, what they want is certainty and coherence. So, I think in the video that I sent around, that when I talked about this last year, I talked about how pilots don't even know how to fly the planes, right? I mean, they know how to push the buttons and this, but you ask a pilot how a plane flies, most of them don't know. And yet we trust it. We live in a world, and 90% of what I use, the computer, my phone, I have no idea how it works. But I'm living in it, and I'm so living in a world that increasingly is, and you've all had this experience. You're working on your phone or your computer and it's going great, and suddenly something doesn't work and you just boil over and you start cursing, or at least I do. I don't know if you do. Why? Because we're frustrated by something we don't understand, right? And it sucks. And that frustration and resentment is deep right now. And it's one of the reasons we have so many political problems. So yeah, I think it's 100% right, Tara. If you want to add anything, you can, Tara. All right, Benjamin Holmes.
Hi, Roger. Sorry for the background noise. That question actually changed what I wanted to talk about, because it made, I don't know, just made a lot of things I think click a bit. I'm relating this to when she talks about the way to make things comprehensible is to speak about them, and it seems like what we're living in now is institutions, I guess, and modes of expression where they are comprehensible to some people, but we're sort of living inside of them. And so I'm thinking about a lot of the outrage when, for instance, like say Trump was deplatformed from Twitter. I think a lot of people had the idea, had sort of internalized Twitter as just like the commons where you can say whatever, as opposed to being a privately owned service and having a snap back to that. It was like, you can't trust, you don't even understand what you're speaking in or the conditions. And certainly, I mean, going back to the Q thing later, I think people are more able to almost sort of create a mental construct that they're living in themselves. And I could, see how that would be only accentuated if we don't have to work and we're not living on the earth. I guess it's like there's just fewer and fewer things that are common to all people. Is that sort of the idea? And so I'm wondering, like in her time, how she, and I missed the beginning, so I'm sorry if I missed this, but how she would relate that to some of the Nietzschean ethics. Would that be like a return to commonality for people? Because it's like, get out of the artifice of tradition, what you've been told before, take responsibility for yourself? Or is that a recipe for accelerating this kind of like balkanization, isolation? If we don't, so
what do you mean by the Nietzschean ethics, Ben?
So in particular, what I mean by that is defining for yourself meaning, rejecting sort of the traditional structures in that case. So, rejecting Christian ethics, for instance. And I'm probably way oversimplifying Nietzsche, so I apologize for that. I'm certainly not a Nietzsche scholar, but what I'm sort of alluding to is the idea, and I think for them, they saw it as a return to something more basic and communal between people, where it's like, let's get rid of this structure that we've been living in this whole time, and we rise above it, take responsibility for ourselves and our lives, define what we want to do. But then at the same time, so is there sort of a dual edge to that? Like, is it possible to do that and to take responsibility and use the freedom that you have at the same time? Does that sort of accelerate the our motion away from a shared life into maybe the endpoint of that, which is totalitarianism, where, as you said before, there was no understanding the system of Stalinist Russia in a way that you could manipulate it and be with other people. The system was terror. The system was, you didn't matter, right? So this is like 8 things I said at once.
No, there's a lot in there, but it's good. And so can you mute yourself so we cut that noise out, and I'll answer. I think there's a really interesting question you're asking, which is, as we become more internal, and as the world becomes internal and we lose the common sense world and common idea, and this is a big theme of this book, the idea of what is the common world, right? So she talks about plurality, but she also talks about how we sit around a table and the table unifies us. It's that common world. And so there's going to be a lot of moments in this book where we talk about works of art. What is a work of art? Well, it's something that lasts. And as it lasts, it provides something that we all talk about. Or, in the United States, example, the Constitution, whatever it is, and there's disagreements about what it is, it's something we talk about. It holds us together. It's a common, it's a shared. And, but as we increasingly all have our own readings of the Constitution or the Declaration or the stories of the United States or whatever it is, they start to split apart. And you're right. And on the one hand, her argument is never going to be stop being free, stop coming up with your new ideas. She thinks it's actually good. This is called what she calls the break in tradition. It's not, you can't undo the break in tradition. It's a fact of our lives and we have to accept it. Her answer to it, if she has an answer, is not rationality, right? And this is a big political question today. I was just in a conversation that will be published soon, I hope, with Masha Gessen about this. But we don't the turn away from Trump to rationality or technocracy or let the experts rule or let the big boys come into the room and rule. There's a need for it, right? We all want it in some way. And yet Arendt's view is that itself is a self-interested and has its own interests on class and interests of the technocracy. And her answer is not that. It's conversation. It's talking, speech. It's being willing to talk with others, the plurality of the world, including those you fundamentally disagree with. And what she says in a number of essays written in the 60s and speeches written in the 60s is that by speaking and talking about justice and piety, we make the world more pious and more just. And the reason is that in speaking about them, even with people we disagree with, even if we disagree, the very act of speaking together and the places we speak, whether it's a Congress or a restaurant or whatever, become common things that we hold, become things that bring us together, that bond us together. And we build a new common world. The goal is not to return to an old common world. The goal is not to resurrect some nostalgic America, make America great again, or make the world great again. There's a lot of people who read Arendt as having a love for the Greeks. She liked the Greeks, but she also had a lot of problems with the Greeks. There's nothing in this book that says we should bring back the Greeks. In fact, that's not her view at all. Her view is take what you can from the Greeks, take what you can from the Romans, take what you can from everyone, and start talking. And in the act of talking, build a new common. And the problem we have today is everyone wants to impose their view on others. They don't want to talk to people they disagree with. We've lost the habit of talking with people we really disagree with. And that's what we need to work on. Thank you. Shri, you're next. Shri, this might be your first time. Shri?
Hi. Yes, this is my first time. And
welcome.
This has been one of the best discussions that I've ever heard on Hannah Arendt. My question, actually, I think it follows from a couple of previous questions. It's about how she thinks that these things are of political significance. So I completely understand that she wants to talk against this elitism that comes in when there's expert language involved. But when she says we can't leave, the reason why it may not be wise to distrust the reason why it may be wise to distrust the political judgment of the scientists. And I'm wondering if her solution is that we discuss the scientific advancements much more publicly, or if her problem is that the science that is happening doesn't doesn't involve the public.
Oh, you froze for a second, Shri. You there? Is it Shri who froze or is it me? I think it's
Shri.
It's Shri. All right.
To the public.
Shri, you froze for a little bit. I'm going to answer your question, which I think I got. I hope that's okay. So I took Shri's question to be a really good one, which is that if we distrust the political judgment of scientists, how should we? What does that mean? And does that mean we, shouldn't? How do we deal with science in the public realm? I can't speak for Arendt. I can only tell you I don't think, I think what she says, if I understand it correctly, is that we have to understand that scientists, there's a great concept which I teach in my courses by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who actually Hannah Arendt liked quite a bit, which he called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. I don't know if that's a widely known term anymore, but the fallacy of misplaced concreteness says that, when you're a student, you're a student, and when you're a journalist, you're a journalist. There's no such thing as a student journalist. Or if you're if you've been a convict, you've been a convict, you're not a former convict. You were a convict, now you're a citizen again. And we shouldn't let one part of ourselves be stand-in for the whole of ourselves. We shouldn't misplace one aspect of ourselves concretely for the whole. And the same, she says, with scientists. Scientists are scientists when they're doing science, and they're citizens when they're doing citizen things. We need scientists, and we should always listen to scientists when they're talking about science. So we should listen to the scientists when they're talking about science, but we shouldn't listen to them and give them more weight in the political sphere. I'll give you an example where this really hit me for the first time, maybe. And Shri, welcome back. I'm sorry you froze. I'm trying to answer your question. I went to a lecture, I don't know, must have been 10, 12 years ago at the Goethe Institute in New York on global warming. And there were a number of people there on the panel, including one very, very famous, I forget his name, but, climatologist, climate scientist. And he was, not talking about climate science. He was talking about the need to politically, change our behaviors. And I sort of stood up and said, you've presented yourself as a climate scientist, and yet you're not talking about, science, you're talking about politics. It strikes me that, in fact, that's counterproductive, because when you do that, you actually politicize yourself, and in politicizing yourself, make it easier to politicize your research. He got very mad and we had a big argument, but it strikes me that, when all those emails were published by people, X number of years ago, and it came out that these climate scientists were sort of fudging the data a little bit in order to make it more understandable or make more sense. What you saw was that when the scientists engage in politics, they actually corrupt the authority and respect of science. And so what Arendt is, I think, saying here is, our public discussions of these matters have to include scientists, in the sense that we have to be able to say to the scientists, is the earth warming? Why? What are the proof? What is the evidence? But once we get the scientific answer, the discussion can't be scientific, because our response is not something that science can give an answer to. So that's how Shri, that's how I understand how she sees this. If that makes sense. I don't know if you got to hear some of that, or if you have a follow-up. I know you got cut off for a little bit.
I followed up, and I think I understand what you're trying to say.
Okay.
I'll look at the video later on.
All right.
Thank you
Thanks
for
a lot,
answering.
Shri. Thanks and welcome.
Thank you.
Ayala, I think you're next.
Oh yeah, I had just thoughts, because lately I think a lot about the issue of technology replacing jobs, that how this is actually a, don't you think that it comes from the capitalistic paradigm and the Max Weber idea of work is, well, not his idea. He pointed to Calvinism and bring the idea that the purpose of man and the value of man is to be judged by the work they do, which can be seriously contested. Maslow, for example, with his human potential pyramid, points out to something that I think we forgot, that most of the creations, the discoveries, the big ideas did not come out of the profit motive. Not because those people were expected to get so much money that made them so creative, but it came from the human, you can call it even animalistic, curiosity and need to get farther and more. So you can, I don't know why Arendt sees it in such negative terms. It would be because capitalists are interested in technology for the profit. It makes them much more profit, and it gives them a huge advantage over the labor market. Yeah. People now, getting a job is it's the employer's advantage.
So Ayala, let me try and answer it, but you suggest that the sort of idea that there's a purpose or value to work is capitalist. Is that your claim?
That for men to be judged, the value of person to judged by the job that they have, which is now pretty much.
So
just what attached to it is that, like healthcare, you get healthcare through your job. So your employment is such a huge value or worth in your life.
Right. It's an interesting, it's a very interesting point, and I'm trying to think it through. So there's two parts that at least I see of this. One is that Arendt argues that the fact that our job is sort of how we're judged, as you put it, or gives us purpose, is in one sense a result of the loss of all other things that gave us purpose. So she'll mention religion, tradition, family. That, it used to be that she says that there were other things that people valued and gave and were judged by, right? Whether they were good religious people or whether they were upstanding. And what she says is that, you know, in the secular and increasingly scientific age, while those things may have some private value to individuals, they no longer accord public dignity and public authority. And that what increasingly gives us our public worth and dignity is our job. And you see this in your own daily or nightly routines when you go to a party like you used to before COVID. I'm sorry, these are old examples. And you would ask someone, hi, what do you do, as your first question? Because that's what we think is important about people. We don't say, you know, what religion are you, or have you prayed today, or, you know, have you spent time with your kids? I mean, you look at what we value by what we talk about. Is it capitalist? You know, it's an interesting question. I mean, Marx, you know, saw the essence of man as his ability to labor and create. You know, it's not clear to me that it's not as much Marxist as it is capitalist. You know, I think from Arendt's point of view, it's not either capitalist or Marxist. It's modern that we increasingly find we are judged by and find purpose in our jobs and our work. And it's because the other things that had given life meaning have increasingly lost their public significance. And so that's what's left is our job. And I think you find that in both capitalist and socialist or Marxist societies. I think it's more of a modern phenomena than one or the other.
Actually, Marx saw it also as a sort of slavery. That's the advantage of capitalism, is the ownership, not just the means of behavior as a factory, but the labor, which is the life of the person, the wages. This is a very elitist view to see the meaning of a person's value as their job. Most people have their jobs, they sweat and labor and slave through it just to put, you know, bread on the table. And religion, it does not, or you know, those public ways of giving meaning to people are from the external. The human potential is such that they will find the meaning themselves. And she agrees to this when she talks about this animal, this life, this instinct that comes from, you know, from birth. You are an animal. You will find the meaning. You will make the meaning by your relationship to the world.
Okay. That's all I'll say is I think that, I think that a lot of people, including people who have, you know, more hands-on menial jobs, find a great dignity in their work. I don't think it's just the elite who find dignity in their work. And it's one of the reasons why many people would rather work even for a low-paying job rather than accept handouts. And I think it's a deep human need to find that dignity. So I think that's just one caveat, but I accept what you're saying. So thank you. Alex, you're up next.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Nice to see you. Reading through this kind of reminded me of a anecdote that Michael Caine actually once talked about when he was a young actor. And he was in a stage play in London, and he got nervous and he wasn't sure what to do. And the director reminded him of something, which was that, you know, Michael, you're on a stage, but that table is real. That fridge you're going to open is real. There's a real carton of milk in it. And I don't really remember the details of what he wrote, but basically the idea was that all these things around you are real. And so you can depend on them to kind of moor you when you're not certain of what you're doing. And that always stuck with me, because it was sort of like the power of real things, as mundane as a table, as a refrigerator, as a quart of milk. And, it kind of underscores for me, the power of reality. And so, as opposed to ideas. And so, I'm new to Arendt, but what I'm picking up on a little bit of it is that, for her, the inquiry is real, not necessarily ideas. The process of inquiry that interfaces with reality. And I think that what some people have brought up, talking about Q or conspiracy theories or things like that. It's even though it's very imperfect, it's people trying to go through a process of inquiry. It's not really about the ideas and how crazy they might be or how worthless they might be, but it's a sort of like a drive, almost like a sexual drive to I must engage in inquiry. And it doesn't matter the crazy place it leads me. It's the process that I'm doing it, that I by inquiring, I interface with reality in the same way that by grabbing the fridge or sitting at the table, I do the same thing. So that's just my observation.
Thank you very much. I love the power of real things. That's going to have to be something I use, and I'll have to quote you on that. So thank you, Alex. When we read the chapter on work in the book, it's going to be a couple of weeks before we get there, but when we get to the work, that's what it's about, the power of real things. One of the things Arendt is going to say is that one thing humans need is a world that is somewhat stable. We can't live if it's constantly changing. And the problem is that the world changes, but it usually changes slowly and over time, and we can adjust. And she says that one of the problems with the technology, the pace of technology today, is that the world changes so fast that we are increasingly homeless and adrift, and especially older people. And it just becomes incredibly difficult to adjust to that new world, which becomes almost alien to them. And that we have to change the world, and we have to continue to change the world, but we have to also understand that there's a certain stability to it that is necessary for human existence, that humans can't live in a world that's constantly changing on a dime. And so we do depend upon these real things, the power of real things, to moor us. And that actually will be a big, when she's talking about work, what she'll argue is that part of our human facility for work is to not labor and make things we consume to keep us alive, but to work and produce things that last, that become mooring elements for us in the real world. And so that's going to be one of the aspects of the human condition that she'll talk about at length in the book, and it's going to become important. Again, it's one that she thinks that automation, technology, and science is threatening, insofar as we make things ever more, they not only change quickly, but they become disposable. And we lose that sense of place that is part of being human. So great insight and question. Thanks very much. Gail Richardson.
Hey, Roger, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Could I get in just because I have to head out in like 5 minutes? I have had my hand raised.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude.
Gail, is that all right? I'm going to let Ben jump one in front and then you'll go.
Sorry, Gail. Sorry. Thanks for opening up this forum. This is my first time being here. Happy to be here. There was a particular couple of sentences that I found confusing that I was hoping we could discuss. It's on page 5 in my book. It's towards the end of the prologue. But she's talking about how what she's going to talk about in the book are these 3 things. that are the most elementary articulations of the human condition, and there's something that are within the range of every human being. And then she says, for this reason, I'm not going to talk about thinking, which is the highest and purest. So I was just sort of, is she saying there that it's not accessible to all people, or I'm trying to understand sort of why she's drawing that distinction and what the implications are for the thing she's asking of us, which is to start thinking what we're doing.
It's a great question, Ben. It's an important point. She talks about three main activities of the human condition in this book: labor, work, and action. And she mentions others, right? That can exist as well. But those are the three that she says are the elementary articulations, and they're within the range of every human being. We all need to live and thus labor. We all need to have a place in the world and thus work, and we all need to act. So then she says, for this and other reasons, the highest and perhaps purest activity of which men are capable, the activity of thinking, is left out of these present conditions. So what is the this and other reasons that thinking is left out? I don't have she never gives an answer. She will say in the last paragraph of the book, right? Well, we'll come back to it. But what she's saying, why is thought left out? I think she thinks that thought is that all humans are capable of thinking. I know she thinks that. She says it many times. But I think she doesn't think that most humans do think. And by thinking, she means thinking without banisters. She means thinking in ways that are free from the prejudices and traditions and religious and moral and ethical guidelines of our time. Everyone is capable of it, but throughout history, most people have not done it. In fact, I think at the end of On Revolution, if I remember it correctly, she'll say maybe more, there's been almost no civilization where more than a very few people have done it, and now maybe fewer than ever. And so she simply doesn't think most people do it. And so while it's there and it's the highest, it's not, she doesn't think that you need to think to be human. You may need to be able to think to be human, right? But you don't need to actually do it to be human, because she thinks most people, all of us are humans, and most of us don't do it. What does she mean by that? She means that most of us don't ever think outside of the parameters of a kind of world in which we're born into. We're not Plato. We're not Auden. We're not Bertolt Brecht. We're not artists. We're not people who push the boundaries of what it means to think. And that's what thinking is for her. It's obviously a very high level and thus elitist idea of thinking. I think she thinks anyone can do it. She just thinks most people won't. They don't have the need or the desire to.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. Gail, you're up. Gail, you still here?
She's muted.
Gail, are you muted?
Yeah, I unmuted.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, here I am. Okay, 2 points to look at. One, there's no sense in Hannah Arendt's writing that we could be the vehicle, that we, the humankind, could be the vehicle for the destruction of the earth itself. And yet this is very much at the forefront of the thinking of, well, 2 examples, Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk. Stephen Hawking, both of them say that we won't have any choice about going into space because we're ruining the earth and we're eventually going to have an extinction event. That's beyond her pale at this point, I think.
Why? I mean, that's the whole point. I think that's the whole point of her argument.
That, I'm sorry, her whole point is that we will create beyond the earth.
Well, I think the point of her argument is that we're in the process of destroying with nuclear weapons. I mean, she's talking more about nuclear weapons than environmental catastrophe, and then technology. But she thinks we're going to destroy the earth. Yeah, I mean, and she thinks we'll either destroy the earth or so remake it that it's no longer natural and it becomes an artificial planet.
I think those are 2 different statements, though, because making the earth over in our own image, so to speak, or creating an artificial environment based on the natural elements that we have to work with, but turning them into something entirely different within which human beings live is different from saying the earth, which defines us now, is going to be impossible for us to inhabit in any way.
Yeah. Okay, but she's just a more careful thinker than people like Musk and Hawking, right? Musk and Hawking are making prophecies which they honestly can't back up. They may be true or they may not. You know,
well, Hawking is a pretty careful thinker. Hawking is a pretty amazing thinker.
Well, Hawking's a great scientist. His you know, whether the earth will, he's not an environmental scientist. He's a great physicist. This is part of the problem, is that people speak about things and use their authority from one area to speak about it in another area. You know, I don't know what Hawking knows about environmental science or not, but that's not where his expertise is. In any case, I don't think anybody knows from my reading, and again, I'm not an expert, but I don't think anybody knows when and if the earth will be fully uninhabitable. I mean, those are prophecies that we can't know.
But I'm not speaking of this as prophecy. I'm speaking of this as the idea world in which people are thinking. I'm thinking within the world which we are talking about and the conversations we're having. In Arendt, like, I love Hannah Arendt, I should say. I absolutely adore her. I was fortunate to have 2 classes with her, one at Cornell and another I audited at the New School. So I've adored this woman from the time I was very young. Hannah Arendt picks out those things which she chooses to name as important to think about. All I'm saying is I don't see in that the sense that we might be forced into other worlds by the destructiveness environmentally, where we kill the very conditions of life on earth. It's not making a huge point about it. That's my reaction to it. I don't know where it goes, so I'm not trying to make it bigger than it is.
Yeah, no, first of all, that's wonderful that you took courses with her. I mean, what a lucky thing, and love that you're still reading her. She talks about the danger to the world in a number of places. Here, in the essay we just read, Introduction into Politics, that we were just reading a couple of weeks ago, for the last few weeks, and she says that, you know, we're in a position where we may destroy the whole world, and she thinks that's very possible, but she doesn't think it's a fate. I mean, this is part of Hannah Arendt, and I'm sure you know it well, Gail. Gail, no. She thinks that we are always free to avoid our fate. Well, we're never. People say we're fated to, you know, destroy the world, or we're fated to go to nuclear war, we're fated to go to war with China. You know, Arendt says, for better or worse, we're free to intervene in the history of the world, and we can change things. And that's an important part of her thinking. It's part of this idea of natality and newness, and that fact that man is a beginner. We're never caught. And so she fundamentally believes in that freedom. And that puts her against a lot of scientific and engineering kind of minds who think that, you know, we've gone down a path and we're stuck on it. She thinks that the human capacity to surprise is amazing. And that's part of her love of the world.
Inconsistent. That's not necessarily inconsistent with what I'm saying. I mean,
okay,
I think they can be joined.
I wasn't trying to say it was. I'm just trying to bring out a difference between what I would consider to be an engineering idea of fatality and her idea.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm not saying it's what you're saying. I think it's something you hear. So
I want to make one more point, and that is when she says we should talk. I mean, the idea of people talking is so lovely. Oh, by the way, she used to say that thought is completely useless. You probably know that. So she didn't have any illusion that thought itself contributed to human welfare. It was itself its own good, and deliriously wonderful for those who indulge in it. But it didn't. She did use the word useless, I believe. But when she talks about political talk, she's talking about talk among people, and she's talking about conversations, and conversations about important things. What we do together is the underlying concern. But there was a writer in the 1950s, Michael Polanyi, who wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. And he talked about the fact that every form of knowledge has a private component. He talked only really about science, art, and religion. But each one of these forms of activity relying increasingly on personal knowledge, which cannot be verified or shared. And what is interesting to me about the political world we live in now is whether or not we give enough attention to that implicit component in our discussions. In other words, I grew up in a very tiny village. I lived most of my professional life in New York City. I'm way back in the little village again. And are we talking the same language when we talk to each other? And what is the forum? Is there a size element here? In other words, you could say that politics works in small settings. I mean, you could make an argument for that.
Yeah, Gail, those are good points. And I think for those of you who've been following the Arendt Center, you know that we're really interested in this idea of citizen assemblies, and we're having a conference on it, which has been postponed again. It'll be in October. But on this question of bringing citizens together to talk and how that works. On revolution, this is a point Arendt makes, that the greatest failing of the American Constitution is that it didn't provide an institutional space for small discussion societies and town hall meetings and local places where people would get together and talk about politics. And she says that's the biggest mistake the founders made, and it's the biggest, well, outside of slavery, I should say. She says that's the worst. So the second biggest mistake they made. And from a constitutional point of view. So I think you're right, and it's an issue she writes a lot about, and we've talked about on revolution before. But if we ever go and talk about it again, well, it'll come up. But pay attention for our conference coming up on October on citizen assemblies. That's where we'll be talking a lot about that.
By the way, I didn't, before I let you go, I just want to say how wonderful this has been, this whole experience.
Thank you, Gail.
My first time, and I'm just really loving it.
We're loving it. Let me just say, we usually go till 2:30. It's 2:40. I can go till 3 today, but I have unfortunately, a meeting at 3. So I'm going to take a couple more. I'll try and get as many as I can in. Please keep your questions brief, and I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can. Lena Simic, you're next.
Hello, hi, thank you very much. And greetings from Liverpool, UK.
Wonderful.
So I wanted to say that the COVID crisis has exposed the difference between key and essential workers and the rest of us, as if we are considering the question, what's meaningful work anew now, and suddenly care and maintenance, possibly those categories that Arendt says as labor, has a new emphasis on importance. At the same time, you also have late anthropologist David Graeber has discussed polemically the concept of bullshit jobs, and which are those jobs without meaning. So right now, also in Europe, especially, I'm not sure about the US, but there is a huge push in policy towards 4-week day works, and that's seen as progressive.
For what?
Like a 4-day working week. Yeah. So we are still attempting to free ourselves from labor and to have a kind of a meaningful time in life. And so to do what now in this COVID time and context? And I'm just thinking about this new space that we have here, which is about collaborating together. Is this a new way of spending time, or have we freed ourselves from labor to do this? I'm just wondering, and in terms of the connection of our time now. So that's my question point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. Those are all great questions. I mean, and yes, condolences to all about David Graeber, who passed away a few months ago. A few things. I think one of the things that I think is often mistaken about this book is that people think that Arendt degrades labor. She doesn't. I mean, in fact, I think one of the reasons I like that quote by Brecht at the beginning is it's a celebration of life, and labor as part of life is deeply important to Arendt. And so, in fact, when we read the labor section, you'll see she's very critical of people, maybe like me, who have lost touch with working with our hands and doing the kind of manual labor that she thinks of as having a life force to it. And that people like me who don't do that enough are increasingly alienated from our earthly life force. And that's part of our humanity. And so, there's no sense in the book that that labor is bad. And I think some people think because it's the lowest of the three, she thinks it is. She doesn't think so at all. It's part of the human condition. Your insight that we're reevaluating essential workers. I wish, maybe, I hope, maybe, I wonder how long that'll last. But I think your other insight is counter to that, and I think is probably more accurate in my view, which is that we're increasingly still trying to get rid of labor. I mean, we have very little respect for it. And yet it's the one thing that gives our lives meaning, she says. I mean, the question is, if we do get rid of labor, what replaces it? And, you asked about this. There's a book by a Polish man, I forget his name, called Flow. Does anyone remember his name? He's a Polish writer who wrote a book called Flow, which is about, that the big problem that governments should work on is providing activities for people who are no longer going to have jobs.
Here it is, Roger.
Oh, who wrote it?
I can't say that word.
I can't see it. Lift it up. Yeah. Okay. I can't say it either, but
he's actually American.
Csikszentmihalyi.
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 Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great book, actually. And, the argument, if I remember it, it's been a while, is something along the lines of, what governments have to do is start giving people who are going to have nothing to do something to do. And it's not about work. It's about giving them hobbies and teaching them to read, but, and this is in a way, a kind of version of the Marxist idea that once we don't need to work, people will learn to fish and philosophize and write poetry. Arendt's very skeptical of that. She thinks that it won't work, and that in the end, people will continue to work in order to consume, and that work and then therefore labor becomes more degrading because it's not about life, it's about consumption. But I think as a political problem, Lena, that it's a real issue. I mean, how many people are going to want to sit around and write poetry and read Arendt? We can say we'd like more people to do it, but there's a certain, there's never been a society where, more than a very small percentage of people are interested in these kind of questions. And I guess there's one view that if we just educate everybody, they'll all be interested in them. I'm not sure I subscribe to that view. I don't, and that's not me thinking we're better than people who aren't. It's actually thinking that, there are other things in life more interesting than talking about Brecht and Arendt. Not for me, but I don't think that what I think is interesting is what everyone else should think is interesting. And I do think it's a big problem that is raised. So thank you, Lena. Klaus.
Hi, thanks, Roger, and greetings from Berlin, Germany. First of all, Gail, it's amazing that you've experienced Arendt in real life. I'm very jealous. I just had two quick questions, more sort of on the interpretation of the text. When she sort of identifies this as a breaking point, she hints at we're at a new stage. I still struggle to understand, and this is one of my favorite books, so I'm very pro Hannah Arendt. But I don't understand what the qualitative difference is in what they've stepped into. So she talks about how we liberate ourselves from labor, and while there may be an extended thought about automation, the liberation from our bodily needs is something that she talks about in conjunction with political freedom, also in other essays, that to liberate ourselves from the most basic biological necessities is also a way to give us actual time to be free and to do other things like action. So I don't understand this, the danger in that people work together rather to liberate themselves or work against nature, if you will, which is almost the whole point of the section on work, where we object to the world, the natural world, by making objects. So that's one question on that. And then Roger, on your emphasis of science, so I really like that you use the start and the end to interpret what Hannah Arendt is saying, which I think is much more I think it's much more correct, but I think it's also much more forceful. I think people want to make Hannah Arendt nice, and they use the three middle parts. And I think she is really very critical of what's going on in the modern world in general. I just wonder your emphasis on science, where that comes from, because what she sort of identifies as the advent of the modern age, those three: the discovery of the new world, the expropriation of church land, and the use of the telescope. I see one of those and maybe one and a half of those as relating to science, but it seems to me that she is making a much more broad sort of civilization critique. So I just wondered why the precedence or primary of science in your interpretation. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Klaus, and thanks for joining us. I'll answer your second question first, because it's an easier question for me to answer, because it's what a lot of my work is on. She when we get to and we read the third section of the third main part of the book on the vita activa and the modern age, well, first of all, let's just remember it's called the vita activa and the modern age. And the modern age, as she says on page 6, and she'll say other places, so it's not just that, the modern age is the age of science, the age which began in the 17th century with the scientific revolution. It's no accident that this chapter begins with a section on world alienation, right? As you rightly put it. But then has the next chapter on Galileo and on science. And what we'll get to when we read those is that she makes a distinction between world alienation, which I think you're absolutely right to say is more civilizational and cultural, and earth alienation. And earth alienation is a product of the rise of science and and the occupation of the Archimedean point and our loss of faith in our senses. And the earth alienation, she will actually say, I'm not sure if I'm going to find it very quickly, is the deeper and more important of these two events. I'm not gonna look for it right now because I won't find it right away. But I'm in any case, I'm not trying to. I don't want to say that. I think they're both important. As I said before, I'm not. I started to go back and forth on which is more important: world and alienation, earth alienation. I think they play together for her mind. But while even science itself is only intensifying a view that already was had by Plato, which is an elevation of truth over common sense, so that it's not radically new and it's part of the world. Part of the world that we've created is a world of common sense, and part of the world we've created is a world in which we denigrate common sense in the name of truth. What the scientific revolution adds to that is first a theoretical and then a more popular full on assault on the common world and on common sense. And that has worldly aspects, as you said, with Protestantism and mapping and traveling the world, and also consumerism. But it's rooted in her mind. The real force of it is in the scientific, what she calls the rape on the senses that science executes. And so we'll focus on that when we get to that chapter on the Vita Activa in the modern age. You know, a little personal, I mean, it's not that important, but I mean, I wrote my first book called The Gift of Science, using gift in the German sense of poison. So, I mean, one of the reasons I think I've been alert to this reading of Arendt is that, you know, my own work on the history of science and philosophy of science has been about the dangers that science poses to the modern age. And it was a work largely driven by Nietzsche and Heidegger, both of whom I think are incredibly influential on Arendt on these questions. So just a little bit of, you know, where I come from on reading this. We can talk more about it, Klaus, when we get to those sections, if that's all right.
Sure.
Your other question on labor, I may have to just, for time wise, let go for now, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll chase you around on this, no problem.
Okay, yeah, email me, feel free to. Vigdis, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this name. Vigdis?
That is right. It's Norwegian name.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I had some thoughts about this earth alienation, because from our the scientific revolution, we kind of know more and more about less and less, because we know more in the microscopic level. We know the smaller part that we can't see with our senses, and we know about the universe. But we have lost this knowledge about how to cope in the earth from as the earth is given. And I mean, this is kind of like I see ingenious people, for instance, they have this knowledge that we kind of have lost in a way. And I wonder is that part of what Arendt thinks about earth alienation? Just this knowledge about, if you think about if our world, as the world we have created, collapses, I mean, we are we need what we have built, electricity and everything. If these things collapses, which they might do, then we're kind of doomed. We don't know how to live from the earth as the earth is given to us.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
no,
think
before we have destroyed it totally, so to say.
I think that's very much what she's talking about, Vigdis. We'll keep talking about it as we go through the book. All we've done is read 8 pages of the prologue. We haven't really started the book yet. But I want us to keep coming back to this question of what you're asking of earth alienation and world alienation. To me, that's what this book is about. It's about the human condition, the vita activa, the way in which our turn away from the vita contemplativa, we'll talk about this next week, to the vita activa, and the rise of sort of technology and science has alienated us from all that matters and focused us on things that don't matter. So yes, I think that's very much her point. So I hope we'll continue with it. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're out of time, but I guess there's one more question open. So I'll take that and I'll try and answer it in 2 minutes. Bradley Wiseman.
Hi there. Yeah, this is my first time, so I just wanted to thank you and all the participants. It's been really enriching to me. A sentence in the prologue that really struck me, maybe the most, were those 2 very brief lines on thoughtlessness, where she says that thoughtlessness is an outstanding characteristic of our time.
Yeah.
And my question is, I wasn't sure if I understood her correctly. Is she saying that thoughtlessness is something that separates the modern world from the modern age? And if that's what she's saying, what is it about the modern world that gives rise to this thoughtlessness?
Great. First of all, I want to just a thing. I love it when people ask questions about the text. And I know a couple of you have, and that's great. So what is she, let's just put this in context. This is on page 5. She's gone through Sputnik and the challenges of Earth, of our leaving the Earth. And then she's gone through the other threat, namely automation. And she says, to these preoccupations and perplexities, right, this book does not offer an answer. Such answers are given every day, and they are matters of practical politics subject to the agreement of many. They can never lie in a theoretical considerations or the opinion of one person. Right? She's giving you an opinion of one person. So one person can't give you the answers. They have to come through talking, through plurality, through politics, the agreement of many. Right? This is her views. What I propose in the following is a reconsideration of the human condition from the vantage point of our newest experiences and our most recent fears. And what are those newest experiences and most recent fears? Well, she's just told you, right? That's the modern world, Bradley. That's our leaving the Earth and loss of late and automation. And those are new experiences, and the atom bomb. And the fears are destruction of the Earth through the atom bomb, the complete cloning and loss of individuality of humans, and a society of laborers without labor. Those are the fears. She says, this is obviously a matter of thought, right? This is what thinking is. So when someone else asked about, why thinking is not for everyone, most people don't want to think about this. They want solutions. They want problems. That's not thinking. That's politics. That's talking. But thinking is that we think about, the human condition amidst the most recent experiences and most recent fears. And unfortunately, we don't do that right now. That's not in. What's in is solving problems, acting, getting clicks, getting views, whatever it is, putting food on the table. But thoughtlessness, the heedless recklessness or hopeless confusion of complacent repetition of truths, which have become trivial and empty, is what most of us do. Almost all of us do part of the time. Most of us do all of the time. And, at a time in which people are almost too afraid just of survival to ask deep questions, to think, we are thoughtless. I mean, most of you know that in 6 years or 5 years after this, she'll write a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she'll subtitle it The Banality of Evil. And she'll then later explain that what she means is by banality is thoughtlessness. The use of cliches, the use of stock phrases, the kind of wanting to get ahead, and the unwillingness and inability to see from the perspective of others, to challenge our basic convictions. That's what she means by thoughtlessness. She thinks that most of us don't have the time to think. We're too busy. We're too goal-oriented. And there's not any benefit that comes from thinking. It doesn't lead to anything. But that's what she says. I'm going to try and think about this human condition in light of the modern age and the modern world. And I'm going to try and say something about it. And it's a work of thought. And you tell me what you think of it. That's what she's saying. Wonderful. We're going to end, but I'm glad we had a great discussion, a great group. I'm welcome to the new people. Welcome back to the older people. We love both. I appreciate the seriousness of the conversation today. We'll send out a new video. I mean, these are videos that we're sending out are from old, like 5 or 6 years ago when I last taught this book. But I'll give a new introduction every week, and I look forward to seeing you. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.